Hello everyone, thanks for all the likes and shares. Please continue to like and share as we continue to do ministry. We certainly do appreciate you spreading the word, so please leave comments, share, tell someone, let someone know that they can find us on YouTube at Grace Ministries EX, as well as on Facebook, Grace Ministries EX. And we are going to continue our study on rebuilding self-worth after, and this study's after is disappointment. Simon Barjona, or Peter, does not disappoint with regards to being an example as to how to deal with rebuilding self-worth after disappointment. And so we're going to look at what happens, how he deals with the disappointment of denying Christ when the rooster crows. But before we look at that, we have to do a little bit of background work in order to fully understand the process, the mental process that he went through to deal with that disappointment. And so we're going to start in Luke chapter 22, verses 31 through 34. If you have your Bible, it would be cool if you could follow along with me. If not, don't worry, I'm going to read all of the scriptures. But so the first one is Luke 22, verses 31 through 34. And it says, "And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat." Now, Jesus has already changed Simon's name to Peter, but he refers to him still as Simon in this moment. It's because Jesus understands that Peter is wrestling with who he's designed to become and who he has been. And we have all been there where we're wrestling with who God has stated that we are versus who we've been in our past. And so he's talking to that part of Peter who says that I can't be, that part of Peter that says I have a past, that part of Peter that says there is something in me that is less than, and so therefore disqualified for. He's talking to that part of Peter, and he's saying it's okay, you're going to become. Jesus was right there with Peter in that moment, but yet with being there with Peter, he still has to talk to the Simon in him. And so sometimes we get, I don't know, a bit down on ourselves because we think that because we've come this far, where Jesus has given us our identity and identified our purpose for us, and we're walking along that path, that now we shouldn't have to deal with the Simon that we used to be. That's not so. According to this, sometimes you have to revisit your Simon. Sometimes you have to talk to that part of you that doesn't believe you can be, you can recover, you can change, you can be better. You have to talk to that part of you. And so Jesus does that here. He says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you. Satan is able to deal with us even when we've prospered to a place where we feel like we've overcome some of our past. And it's in that moment that he desires to sift us. And to sift is to separate the good part from the bad part. And so Satan wants to literally sift us, and he uses what we've been through, our circumstances, our conditions, to do that, to have us thinking that we can live two ways, that there is two parts of us, that there is a part of us that is and a part of us that will be. There's a part of us that's given over to Christ, and there's a part of us that we can hold back to ourselves. Satan has a desire to sift you, to separate you, so that you live in a way that has a dual personality. And a lot of times, as Christians, we fall into that trap. And that's why so many times people say that we are hypocrites, or that we don't live what we preach. It's because we are wrestling with dual natures. There's a part of us that is sold out to Christ, that just wants to do the will of God, is giving ourselves over to the will of God. Then there's this other part of us that has a sinful nature. We're all born in sin, shaped in iniquity. And so we are, sometimes we can be tempted to separate those two and say, well, this is just who I am. This is just how I was made. And I do the Christian thing too, but that's a separate part of my life. When we do that, we render our Peter, our called, our set aside person, we render that part of us ineffective. And so we have to realize that even though we have this dual nature and we're wrestling, one is wrestling against the other, that they're not separate. But one needs the other. You see, the way you were made and the way you were created and what God placed in you from the foundations of the world, what he scooped out of the earth in order to form you is a necessary part of you being your Peter. It's essential. However, there are parts of your assignment that just simply needs to be converted. And I'll talk about that in a second. In verse 32, he says, but I have prayed for you that thy faith fail not, and when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. And that's what I mean. You see, all of this is a faith walk. And there are parts of us that just doesn't want to believe. We don't necessarily know if this whole God thing is really for us. We wrestle with that. And that's just being honest. But as you continue in this process of not allowing your faith to fail, as you continue in this process of walking in the truth that is Christ and who he is, what happens is more and more of you becomes converted. You become more and more your Peter and less your Simon. Now, your Simon, the characteristics, the essential nature, the part that God created, your personality, your character, all of that is part of who Peter is. His impetuous self, all of that is necessary, and God uses every aspect of his character. But those aspects have to be converted. And so Jesus says it, he says, when thou art converted, when all of those aspects are given over to the faith that you have in Jesus Christ, then turn around and strengthen your brethren. So Jesus acknowledges that Peter's wrestling with something, that he's wrestling with his past, he's wrestling with who he used to be, he's wrestling with the process of all of him becoming converted. And the reality sinks in. Look at verse 33 and 34. He says, and he said unto him, Lord, he meaning Peter, says unto him, Lord, I am ready to go with thee both into prison and to death. That's the converted part of him, Peter, that says, I am going to go all the way. And then Jesus says to him in verse 34, I tell thee, Peter. And so he speaks back to Peter because Peter has stood up in Simon. Peter has stood up in this moment, said, I'm going to go all the way. Jesus speaks to Peter and says, I tell thee, Peter, the cock shall crow this day before thou shalt thrice deny that thou knowest me. I am telling you that in this process, Simon is going to show back up. And I know that when that happens, it's going to be a disappointment to you because, Peter, you feel like you've come this far. Peter, you feel like you've accomplished this great thing. And Peter, you feel like you're so converted that you will go even to death, to prison and to death with Christ. But he's saying there's a part in you that's going to rise back up. When it is tested, you will recognize it, you will see it. There will be a moment when you have to acknowledge it. And it's when the rooster crows. When you hear that rooster crow, you'll realize that you've already denied me 3 times. Peter, you're going to experience this disappointment. And as Jesus said, Peter did. And so we go to Luke 22, verse 54, and I'm going to read down to verse 62. It might take a minute, but it's worth the hearing. Verse 54 of chapter 22, then took they him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house, speaking of Jesus, and Peter followed afar off. And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. But a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire and earnestly looked upon him and said, this man was also with him. And he denied him, saying, Woman, I know him not. And after a little while another saw him and said, Thou art also of them. And Peter said, Man, I am not. And about the space of 1 hour, after another confidently affirmed, saying, Of a truth, this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter said, Man, I know not what thou sayest. And immediately, while he yet spake, the cock crew. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. In this moment, we see Peter's disappointment. He was disappointed in himself that through the trial, he had not been able to hold on to the Peter that he was becoming. But in that moment, saw himself slide back into the Simon that he was. He had to acknowledge that he was not fully converted. In other words, there was some place in him that still needed to be strengthened by Christ. We too have to come to that place where we acknowledge that there's some place in me that still needs Christ to strengthen that area. I still need Jesus in this area. Beloved, there will always be a place where we still need Christ. We still need him to strengthen us in that area. And so when we find ourselves at that place where we've disappointed not anyone else, but we've disappointed ourselves because of our own behavior, because we have done something that we know is contrary to the will of God, is contrary to the plan of God for our lives, we have to acknowledge. Jesus told me about this. We've got to make this moment clear for ourselves. I was forewarned that I was going to be tempted in this area, and I fell. The next thing we see Peter do, it says that he went out. Step away from the situation. Don't try to fix it in it. Step away from the situation and take a moment to analyze why you made the decision you made. Why we came to the conclusion that it was better to be Simon in that moment than to be Peter. Ask those questions. Then it says that Peter wept bitterly. Acknowledge the emotions attached to disappointing yourself. Be it sadness, be it confusion, whatever the emotion is, acknowledge that emotion and then begin to deal with it. If there is no emotion attached to the disappointment that comes from letting down Christ, then there has to be the question as to whether or not there is full conversion anywhere. And that's something that only you and I can answer for ourselves. But if the emotion is there, acknowledge it. Understand that the sorrow comes from loving Christ and realizing that this person that you absolutely love, you've disappointed. And that's why you're disappointed with yourself. But then, get back into position. The next time we see Peter is Luke 24, verse 9. But I want to read it in context, so I'm going to start at verse 6. And he is not here, but he is risen. This is the angel speaking to the women who found Christ, the tomb empty rather. And so he says he is not here, he's the angel speaking, but he is risen. Remember how he spake unto you when he was in Galilee, saying, The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again. And they remembered his words and returned from the sepulchre and told all these things unto the 11 and all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and other women that were with them, which told these things unto the apostles. And their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not. Then arose Peter and ran unto the sepulchre, and stooping down he beheld the linen cloths laid by themselves, and departed, wondering in himself at that which was come to pass. So Peter, even though he had this moment of disappointment, and even though he had this moment where he failed, even though he had this moment where the devil looked as if he succeeded in separating himself from himself, in separating him so that he was one way with Christ and another way when Christ wasn't around, even though it looked like there was success, Peter went through the process and immediately got himself back in line. That is where we win. If we don't get to the place where we get ourselves back in line and back in position, then the devil wins. He's been successful at separating us. He's been successful at getting us to a place where we deny what Christ has said about us and where he said he's taking us to. But if we can get back to the place, back in position, then he is defeated. At the same time, we've got to be sure that we're still working through the process of conversion. Because Peter got back in his place of position, he is among the disciples, but then he's first among the disciples to respond to the news. Not only is he first among the disciples to respond to the news, but he's first among the disciples to experience the wonder at Christ's resurrection. He is the first one to have this experience of understanding the implications of Christ's resurrection. And he goes on to perform great works, great wonders amongst the Gentiles, amongst the Jews rather, and is able to bring Christ to them. But it starts with him being the first. So when we go through disappointment, especially disappointment within ourselves, we go through these steps of acknowledging what Christ has said to us, stepping away from the situation so that we can analyze it and look at the places where we need to do better, step up. We acknowledge the emotions attached to it, but then we get back in our position so that we can be used by God to do what he called us to do. Don't allow disappointment to pull you out of position and to snatch victory out of your hands. Here's the other thing. This process is the same process we go through when we disappoint others or are disappointed by others. You see, disappointment, again, is an attempt to separate us from the cause. And if you can get separated or pulled aside, then your purpose isn't fulfilled. And so we go through the process, look at it, acknowledge the fact, acknowledge what Jesus has told you. When someone else disappoints you, acknowledge what Jesus has told you about where you're going. Don't be distracted by the fact that they disappointed you. Step away from the situation. How is this working for my good? What is it that I'm supposed to learn by going through this process? What is it that I'm supposed to gain? So step away from the situation. Acknowledge the emotions attached with being disappointed. Even when someone else disappoints you, I am disappointed by this, and so therefore this saddens me, and this hurts me. This makes me wonder. This makes me question. But no matter what, get back in position. Don't allow the fact that someone else disappointed you to pull you away from your God-given purpose. That's how you deal with disappointment and bounce back from setbacks. We love you so much. We appreciate you joining in with us as we do these studies. There's more to come. Again, please like, please share. We love you guys, and we'll talk to you again soon. God bless. Bye-bye.